Hi, everyone. Welcome to APLING614, where this week we're going to be talking about language acquisition and bilingual education. A lot of these readings are probably review if you've taken theories and principles of language teaching, and I think they're a nice overview of the theories that we've kind of covered so far in the course. So first I wanted to talk a little bit about First, I wanted to talk about what we talked about last week, where we examined the frameworks, models, and variables, which I know is sometimes overwhelming. But basically, I understand that this can be overwhelming, but I really wanted you to recognize that this is just a basis for a lot of the stuff that we're going to be talking about when it comes to things like typologies for SLA and research methods and the ideas of like qualitative and quantitative aspects of researching SLA. This is just a good overview and a basis for you to expand your own SLA research going forward. What's interesting too is that these are through these frameworks and models and things like monoglossic, diglossic, heteroglossic frameworks are going to be interwoven throughout a lot of the work that we're going to be doing for the rest of the semester. So if you need a review of these topics, or if you feel a little overwhelmed now, don't worry, we'll be kind of be going in more detail as we go along. So this lecture's focus is going to be the Valdez et al. Chapter that we read. So some of the concepts that we talked about in Valdez et al. You've read previously in the Garcia and Crawford, so it might feel like there was a lot of repetition this week. But basically, So there are two main focuses of the Valdez et al. There are two main shifts that directly impact the teaching and learning of language in bilingual education programs. So the first idea, this first shift is changing the perspective on the language. And the second is changing the theoretical positions of the field of second language acquisition. So in relation to these two shifts, what we see over time is this trend moving forward from the individual and psychological constructs to a more socio-political, ideologically grounded, for looking at some of the concepts we talked about last week and the week before about language ideologies in these newer conceptions. So in these newer ideas, we're talking about language as a social construct and not just this like static neutral artifact of a community. It is something that is constantly evolving. It is something that is constantly being situated depending on the context and the people speaking it. The other thing is learners are no longer categorized in the second shift. Learners are no longer categorized by a deficit or what they can't do in a language, or what they're unable to acquire because of their L1, or what they're unable to acquire because of their motivation or their background. Instead, this takes a more positive view of what learners can do in the language and how they can use the language to communicate. There's also this shift of understanding that there's variability across language learners, and it's totally natural to have difference in aptitude and differences in motivation and differences in intelligences and all that stuff that we've talked about in previous weeks. So some of the things that some of the things that we've talked about kind of in the history of bilingual education models was this idea of this deficit, and we talked about this in the discussion with the Rachel Jantel example too, where you don't necessarily speak one language entirely. You speak, if you're trilingual or multilingual, you speak fractions of a language instead of being completely proficient. But that thankfully is going by the wayside now in a lot of these models. This next idea is that there is a shift in terms of the theoretical perspectives of bilingualism and what it is and what it means to be bilingual. Also, a lot of the research has looked at how it relates to the individual and the society. So older ideas of bilingualism were super focused on languages in the mind of the individual. And basically, a bilingual individual was seen as a person who could do all of the same things using the two different languages and you can basically, you're equally proficient in the two languages. But there's been a shift to thinking about how bilingualism is basically co-constructed throughout society, and how you could code switch or be proficient in one arena or another. So like if you could code switch between yeah, you basically can read the context of a situation. You could code switch depending on who's there, or you could take an idea of like Arabic, let's say, where you are proficient in perhaps the native dialect of a community, so like Egyptian Arabic, let's say, but you're not necessarily proficient in the Fusha, the modern standard Arabic, or the institutional Arabic of the greater institution. So that would be like a interesting idea about a diglossic approach there. Yeah. So for your discussion question this week, I'm curious to see if any of you have seen any activities that you've noticed in your own classrooms, or any of the research that you've studied outside of this class or in other classes, that reinforce or break down this idea of this hegemonic idea about language. So it could be like a language arts class, or an ESL class, or structured English immersion, or foreign language classroom. So basically, are there policies or strategies that reinforce or break down these hegemonic ideas about language? That's discussion board number 1. So I'd like to see if you have any examples of that in your own experiences. So Valdez et al. Talks about this idea where he summarizes basically they summarize the evolution of the conceptualization of language. So they talk about how language was previously conceptualized again as this biologically endowed human faculty. This should trigger ideas of the Chomskyan definition of language and UG. And that really shifted to an idea of language as patterns of structure. So if you have taken in 605, you probably talked about this contrastive analysis hypothesis, where you can look at the differences between L1 and L2, and look at the differences in patterns you have between your L1 and L2, and how you can predict errors that the learner will make in their L2. The other thing that's really fascinating is that I'm hammering this in a lot, but it's kind of this idea of language as social practice. So how language is constructed through society, through interaction, and through the people that you're speaking to, but also critically through the socio-political context that you're in. So with this change and shift of how we're talking about language, we can talk about how there's been a shift to the kind of the cognitive underlying grammar to a more socially oriented theory of language. There's been a ton more emphasis on the nature and the exact role of this social construct that I mentioned in the previous slide. So this idea of interaction and socialization in kind of the more micro and macro social aspects of language use. So one theory that has gained a lot of traction in recent years is this idea of the complexity theory. So there is this idea of, so Valdez quotes, SLA is seen as a complex adaptive process, which is itself self-organizing and intrinsically variable. Interacting elements constantly change, and language forms are considered to emerge in language use. So again, this is just a detail of the socially constructed concept there. Yeah. So also, in previous years, I'm sorry, in this class, the literature that we saw from previous years highlight this kind of quantitative approach to studying how language learners acquire a second language. So more like, when do you acquire, let's say, noun phrases, or when do you acquire a certain ability that is quantified, and what is the percentage, what are these numbers, what is the statistical significance. Whereas now we're doing a little bit more qualitative and ethnographic research methods to basically focus on the socialization, the socio-political context, and really focus on the individual across space and time. When it comes to the context of globalization, it's really important to use these qualitative and ethnographic studies because they are so subjective, but they are really important to illustrate kind of a holistic approach. You can't just look at a snapshot of a graph and say, oh, I've understood how this one individual or this one community approaches, language acquisition, or things like their intrinsic motivation, or things like how they feel about certain language ideologies and identities. So yeah, overall, there's been a shift kind of from this nativistic, quantitative perspective to a more qualitative ethnographic perspective. Okay. So, along with the shift in theory and shift in research methods, there's also been a shift and an evolution in the theories connecting teaching methods. So from this methods class, I'm sure you've seen other structural models of teaching second language acquisition, like grammar translation method or audiolingual method, which are super structured and oriented on teaching grammar and pronunciation. So we're talking about lots of drills, lots of tasks, lots of repetition, but not a lot of attention to language use or the meaning of it. Later on, there is a evolution towards a more purposeful activity. So how you use language in authentic settings, or how you use language to accomplish specific tasks rather than focusing on language structure and grammar. So I can tell you, like, Arabic language pronunciation early on in my Arabic studies. I'm sorry, why did I say pronunciation? Early, when I was learning Arabic many, many years ago, decades ago, with the context of like productivity and grammar, it was hammered into me this, like, there's this diagram of a matrix of all of the verb forms and all of the pronouns that can be used, and all of the, like, what's it called, like, cases, like nominative, accusative, genitive, objective, all this stuff, and then all of the different pronouns that adapt in these different environments. Basically, I remember sitting and just staring at it. And it wasn't until years later when I had a professor who was a little bit more, again, like task-based, and we worked on focusing on like purposeful activities as opposed to the grammatical structure. And I can't tell you how much more I was able to hold on to that information. And I didn't feel like I was just doing it rote, like flashcard memory tasks. Yeah, so again, we can talk about how this relates to intelligences, but this is another one of those evolutions where these things like motivation, aptitude, intelligence, these are all things that are incorporated into the new components of SLA. So there's been a shift in influence. So Krashen's model from the 1980s is more of like this, looking at comprehensible input in the socialization, where we think about language as being recontextualized into a socialization model of learning language, where you have learners as apprentices who are being exposed to a more seasoned, more expert user of a language, and through interaction with them, they acquire an language use to mimic kind of this expert that they're exposed to. But there's also been a heavier, been a stronger kind of connection with this idea of a socialization perspective, more emphasis on peer models. So not necessarily, oh my God, like apprentice expert, more like, yeah, equals. So we can talk about this idea of, people learning in the dual immersion model, where you have half of a class more or less of native speakers and the other half are non-native speakers, and they interact as peers and they learn from each other and they do from their teachers. So again, it's not like the socialization of being an asymmetrical authority. It's more peer-to-peer of dual immersion. So that's been the most recent evolution. Today, Valdez et al. Described the major theories and policies and sociopolitical factors that have influenced bilingual education today. And they include how the US really emphasizes standards and accountability. So we talked about No Child Left Behind and then Common Core. There's been a heavy focus on the development of academic English, which kind of goes back to this idea of BICS versus CALP. So BICS, if you recall, is the basic interpersonal communication skills versus CALP, which is cognitive academic language proficiency. So academic and social languages is a tricky thing to define. And I have a real issue kind of going back to this concept of language versus dialect, like language is a dialect with an army and a navy kind of idea. And this is going to lead us to our second discussion question. But basically, how can you define what academic language is anyway? How can you define something that is so institutionally dependent? And academic language will vary from whether you're in a different state or a community, or if it's who the teacher is, and it's just so subjective that you can't actually, in my opinion, it would be very difficult to pinpoint how you define it. So I'd be really, really curious to see what you all say about that in your discussion questions. Let me see what's the next slide. I want to just, oh yeah, Valdez has this great quote, man. So this is a really important quote, I think. So Valdez says, from a socially oriented view, on the other hand, academic language could be seen as part of a communicative repertoire that includes various codes, styles, registers, ways of speaking and writing that emerge or recede according to context, purpose, interlocutors, and topic. So it's a really important to realize that this is a language period is a dynamic entity, but dynamic construct, I should say. But academic language in particular is also incredibly dynamic, and that changes over time and who's speaking and all that stuff. So it's a really fascinating concept to think about how you're evaluating somebody on their academic language proficiency in that CALP. I think that, yeah. So what I wanted to just review Valdez et al. With you for this presentation, for this lecture, because I understand that a lot of it might be review when we're talking about SLA and bilingual education and models and things like that. But I really want you to kind of focus on in the discussion board is this idea of the ever-evolving dynamic component of language and how we can then appropriately evaluate a student's proficiency based on this dynamic thing. Basically, if the goal keeps moving, how are we going to know if a student reaches that goal? Okay, and then the next, oh yeah, so next week we're going to be talking about monoglossic and heteroglossic frameworks. I'd like you to read all of chapter 9, and then for chapters 10 and 11, please just focus on the introduction to each chapter. You don't have to read all of them in super detail, but I want you to pick out 2 case studies from these chapters and prepare to discuss them in the discussion board for the week. And yep, I'll post more things about your midterm in the next few days so that I can give you more context in response to your reading responses. And I think that's it for me. I'll be posting a handful more lecture videos and instructional guides for the assessments to come. Okay, great. Thank you all for your hard work, and I appreciate all your interactions and stuff on the discussion board. So have a lovely week, and thank you very much.